businessman kicked out a homeless man from his Christmas party. Hours later, he was paralyzed to discover it was his father who disappeared 30 years ago. Snowflakes fell gently on the Mitchell mansion in Evergreen Falls, Connecticut, where Christmas lights twinkled across the perfectly manicured lawn. Inside, the annual charity gala was in full swing, with waiters in black ties carrying champagne flutes through crowds of the city's wealthiest residents. Thomas Mitchell, a successful 45-year-old real estate developer, stood at the grand staircase, greeting potential investors with his practiced smile. His steel gray suit matched his cold demeanor perfectly as he discussed profit margins and market expansion. From across the room, his 16-year-old daughter Sarah watched him with growing disappointment. "And that's how we'll transform the old district into luxury condominiums," Thomas was saying when a commotion at the front door interrupted him. A security guard was struggling with an elderly man in worn-out clothes who had somehow made it past the front gate. "Please," the old man's voice cracked with emotion. "I must speak with Thomas Mitchell. It's important." Thomas's face darkened with anger. "Remove him immediately," he ordered, his voice sharp enough to make nearby guests flinch. The old man's crystal blue eyes, strikingly familiar, scanned the room desperately. "Thomas, please, the medallion, remember the promise." Sarah rushed forward, her green velvet dress swishing across the marble floor. "Dad, stop. It's Christmas Eve. We can at least hear what he has to say." "Sarah, get back here now." Thomas grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the scene. "You're embarrassing me in front of our guests. You're embarrassing yourself." Sarah yanked her arm free, tears welling in her eyes. "What happened to you? Mom would be so ashamed." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Thomas's face reddened with rage and humiliation. "Take him out," he barked at the security guards, "and make sure he never gets past our gates again." As the guards dragged the old man toward the door, Eleanor Mitchell, Thomas's 70-year-old mother, emerged from the crowd. Upon hearing the old man's voice, all color drained from her face. She stumbled, catching herself on a nearby chair. "Eleanor?" A friend rushed to steady her. "Are you all right?" "That voice," Eleanor whispered, her hand clutching her chest. "It couldn't be." The old man called out one last time as he was pushed into the snowy night. "The medallion of promise, Thomas, your father's medallion." Thomas turned his back on the scene, straightening his tie. "Well, that was unfortunate. Now about those development plans." But the investors were already whispering among themselves, throwing disapproving glances his way. Sarah stormed up the stairs, her sobs echoing through the suddenly quiet mansion. Eleanor remained frozen, staring at the front door as if she'd seen a ghost. A security guard approached Thomas. "Sir, the man dropped something outside. Should I?" "I don't care what that beggar dropped," Thomas snapped. "Clean it up and make sure this incident doesn't repeat itself. I have important people here tonight." As the party awkwardly resumed, none of the guests noticed Eleanor quietly slipping away to her room, her hands shaking as she opened an old jewelry box hidden in her dresser. Inside was an empty velvet pouch labeled Richard's Medallion, Christmas 1980. She touched the empty pouch, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "After all these years," she whispered. "You finally came home, Richard. You finally came home." The morning after the charity event, Thomas sat in his office at Mitchell Enterprises, staring at the skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The local newspaper's headline glared at him from his desk. "Christmas charity or Christmas shame? Mitchell Gala ends in controversy." "Don't let it bother you, Thomas." Victor Sterling, his business partner, tossed the newspaper into the trash. "These bleeding hearts don't understand what it takes to build an empire." Thomas rubbed his temples. "The investors are nervous, Victor. We need them focused on the downtown renewal project, not gossiping about some homeless man." "About that," Victor spread blueprints across the desk. "St. Francis Community Center is the last property we need. Once we demolish it, the luxury condos can begin construction." "St. Francis?" Thomas frowned. "Isn't that the old shelter downtown? A waste of prime real estate," Victor smirked. "They're behind on property taxes. One more month and we can snap it up for pennies." Back at the mansion, Sarah snuck into her father's study. She'd been searching for answers since last night's incident. In a dusty filing cabinet, she found an old folder labeled Mitchell Family Properties, 1980. Her hands trembled as she read, St. Francis Community Center, original deed holder Richard Mitchell. "What are you doing in here?" Eleanor's voice made Sarah jump. "Grandma, I found something about Grandpa Richard." Sarah showed her the documents. "The shelter Dad wants to tear down? It belonged to our family." Eleanor sank into a chair. "Your grandfather built that place. It was his pride and joy before." "Before what?" "Before the crash of '80 took everything." Eleanor's eyes clouded with memories. "The bank seized most of our properties, but Richard had already donated St. Francis to the church. It was the only thing that survived." At Mitchell Enterprises, Thomas's assistant interrupted his meeting. "Sir, the press is asking about the St. Francis demolition. They're saying dozens of families will be homeless for Christmas." "No comment." Victor cut in. "Thomas, we need to move fast. Sign these papers and we can start evacuation notices tomorrow." Thomas stared at the documents, remembering childhood visits to his father's construction sites. Richard Mitchell had always said, "We build homes, son, not just houses." "Thomas," Victor snapped his fingers. "Focus. Remember what happened to your father? His bleeding heart ruined him. You're not him. You're a winner." Sarah's voice echoed from last night. "Mom would be so ashamed." "I need time to review these." Thomas pushed the papers away. "Time?" Victor's friendly facade cracked. "The investors' meeting is next week. Either we show progress, or they walk." "You want to end up like your father? A nobody?" Meanwhile, Sarah discovered more papers in the study. Photos of the community center's opening day showed a younger Richard Mitchell cutting the ribbon, beaming with pride. In his hand glinted a medallion, the same one mentioned last night. "He made a promise that day," Eleanor said softly, joining Sarah. "Said as long as he had that medallion, he'd never put profit over people." She wiped a tear. The day he disappeared, the medallion vanished too. Victor's words rang through the office. "Sign now, Thomas. Prove you're nothing like your failure of a father." Thomas reached for the papers when his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Dad, I found something about Grandpa Richard. Please come home." "Everything okay?" Victor asked, pen extended. Thomas stood up. "Meeting's over. I need to see my daughter." "The investors won't wait forever." Victor called after him. "Don't throw away everything we've built." But Thomas was already gone, his father's words echoing in his mind. "We build homes, son, not just houses." In his car, he didn't notice Victor making a call. "He's wavering. Start Plan B. The Mitchell empire belongs to us, one way or another." The Mitchell mansion dining room fell silent as James, the security guard from last night, placed a small object on the table. "Found this outside after the incident, Mr. Mitchell." The golden medallion caught the light of the chandelier, its surface worn but still showing the engraved words, "Faith, Family Forever, Christmas 1980. Eleanor's teacup crashed to the floor. "Richard's medallion," she gasped, her hands shaking. She reached for it but stopped short, as if touching it would make everything too real. "Mom?" Thomas rushed to steady her as she swayed in her chair. "Your father." Eleanor's voice trembled. "He wore this every day for 15 years, said it was his reminder of what truly mattered." She looked up at Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "The homeless man. It was Richard. Your father has come back." Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "That's why his eyes looked so familiar. They're just like Dad's." Thomas stared at the medallion, memories flooding back. Sunday mornings watching his father get ready for church, the medallion always catching the sunlight. The day Richard helped a family repair their roof for free, telling Thomas, "The medallion reminds me, we're blessed to be a blessing." The day he disappeared, Eleanor continued, "I thought he'd taken it with him. But finding it here, now." A commotion at the front door interrupted them. Victor burst in, followed by Thomas's assistant. "I'm sorry, sir," the assistant stammered. He insisted it was urgent. Victor's eyes locked onto the medallion. "Thomas, we need to talk. Now." "This isn't a good time," Thomas started, but Victor cut him off. "The press is asking questions about last night. Social media is buzzing with videos of the incident. Our investors are nervous." He lowered his voice. "And now I hear Sarah's been digging into old property records?" Sarah stood her ground. "The community center belonged to my grandfather. You're trying to destroy his legacy." "Legacy?" Victor scoffed. Your grandfather was a fool who lost everything. Thomas, we need to get ahead of this story. Sign the demolition papers now. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. Richard wasn't a fool. The crash of '80 destroyed so many lives. She clutched her chest, struggling to continue. Grandma, Sarah rushed to her side. He tried to help too many people. Eleanor managed. Refinanced everything to save his workers' jobs. When the banks called in the loans, she looked at Thomas. The night he disappeared, he left a note, said he couldn't bear to watch his family suffer for his mistakes. Thomas picked up the medallion, feeling its weight. A memory surfaced, his father teaching him to read using the engraved words, explaining their meaning. Faith means trusting in something bigger than yourself, Richard had said. Family means standing together in hard times. Forever means the choices we make echo through generations. Enough of this sentimentality, Victor snapped. Thomas, your father's choices ruined this family once. Don't make the same mistake. Sarah pulled out the documents she'd found. Look at these, Dad. Grandpa didn't fail. He saved hundreds of jobs. The community center has helped thousands of people. And now it's worth millions, Victor countered. Business is business. Thomas stared at the medallion, then at his mother's tears, his daughter's determined face, and Victor's cold smile. The weight of 30 years of choices, his father's and his own, pressed down on him. Business isn't just business, Thomas said quietly. Not anymore. Victor's face hardened. Don't do something you'll regret, Thomas. I'm trying to protect everything we've built. No, Thomas replied. You're trying to destroy everything my father built. And I almost helped you do it. Then you leave me no choice. Victor headed for the door. Check your email in an hour. See what choosing family over business really costs. After he left, Eleanor touched the medallion in Thomas's hand. Richard always said this medallion had a way of revealing what's in people's hearts. We have to find him, Sarah said. Before it's too late. Thomas nodded, finally understanding the promise engraved on the medallion's surface. And we have to save the community center. It's time to make things right. Thomas drove through the snowy streets of Evergreen Falls, gripping the medallion in his coat pocket. Every church and shelter he visited had the same response. They knew the old man, but only as John. He's been around for years, said a soup kitchen volunteer. Always helping others, never accepting much help himself. Did he mention where he stays? Thomas asked, showing a recent security camera photo from the mansion. The St. Strap Francis Center, she replied. He volunteers there most nights. Thomas's stomach tightened, the same center he'd planned to demolish. Meanwhile, Sarah sat at her computer, scrolling through years of local news archives. Grandma, look at this, she called to Eleanor. Someone's been making anonymous donations to keep St. Francis running. Every time it faced closure, mystery money appeared. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen. The amounts? They matched the dividends from Mitchell Enterprises' first stock offering. But that's impossible, Sarah frowned. Only shareholders from the company's early days would have those exact amounts. Eleanor's hands trembled. Your grandfather never sold his shares. The bank couldn't touch them during the crash. They were in a trust. Sarah's eyes widened. So all these years, he's been watching over us, Eleanor finished, using what little he had left to protect his legacy. At Mitchell Enterprises, Victor gathered the board of directors. Thomas has become unstable, he announced. This homeless man situation has him questioning everything. Our investors are ready to pull out. What do you suggest? Asked a board member. Victor smiled coldly. I've prepared emergency measures to protect the company. All I need is your support. Back at St. Francis, Thomas found more surprises. The center's wall of donors showed a familiar pattern. Small but steady contributions from John Smith spanning decades. John's our guardian angel, said Sister Mary, the center's director. Never misses a night serving meals, says everyone deserves dignity. When did he start coming here? About 30 years ago. Showed up one Christmas Eve, saying he needed to honor a promise. Thomas's phone buzzed, an urgent email from the board. Victor had called an emergency vote to remove him as CEO. The reason? Emotional instability affecting business judgment. Dad, Sarah's voice came through on another call. The donations to St. Francis, they're from Grandpa. He never really left us. He's been protecting the center all along. Thomas stared at the donor wall, seeing his father's hidden sacrifice. For 30 years, Richard Mitchell had lived as a homeless man while secretly using his remaining resources to help others. "Sir?" Sister Mary touched his arm. "Are you all right?" "The man you know as John," Thomas's voice cracked. "Have you seen him today? He left early this morning, said something about finishing what he started." She paused. "Strange thing, he left his usual coat, said he wouldn't need it anymore." Thomas's phone buzzed again. "Victor, board meeting in 1 hour. Accept removal quietly, or I release evidence of your father's crimes." "What crimes?" Thomas typed back. "Tax fraud, 1980. Your father's signature on falsified documents. It would destroy what's left of the Mitchell name. Your choice." Thomas gripped the medallion tighter. The engraved words burned in his mind. Faith, family, forever. Eleanor called next. "Thomas, I need to tell you something about the night your father left. Something I've never told anyone. Mom, I'm dealing with an emergency at the company." "Victor was there that night," Eleanor cut in. "He worked for the bank. He gave your father papers to sign." Richard refused, saying they were fraudulent. The next day, he disappeared. Thomas froze, pieces falling into place. "Victor's been planning this for 30 years? He wanted the company even back then." Richard stood in his way. Eleanor's voice strengthened. "Your father didn't commit fraud, Thomas. He prevented it." Through the center's window, Thomas watched snow begin to fall. Somewhere out there, his father was planning to end his 30-year exile. Victor was moving to steal the company. And the St. Francis Center, his father's last legacy, hung in the balance. "Sarah," he said into the phone, "get everyone to St. Francis. It's time to end this, tonight." The snowstorm intensified as Thomas pushed through St. Francis Center's doors. Inside, volunteers served Christmas Eve dinner to dozens of people seeking shelter from the cold. "John usually runs the kitchen on holidays," Sister Mary explained, leading Thomas through the crowded hall. But tonight, they found Richard in the small chapel, kneeling in prayer. His weathered face lifted at their approach, those familiar blue eyes, Thomas's eyes, filling with tears. "You found the medallion," Richard said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me who you were at the mansion?" Thomas demanded. "Would you have believed a homeless man claiming to be your father?" Richard stood slowly. "After 30 years, I had no right to disrupt your life." "No right?" Thomas's voice cracked. "You're my father, a father who abandoned his family." Richard pulled a cardboard box from beneath a pew. "I've kept every newspaper article about you, your success, your buildings, your charity events. I was so proud, even if I didn't deserve to be." Thomas opened the box, finding decades of clippings. His first real estate deal, company launches, even his wedding announcement. "The accident," Sarah's voice came from the chapel entrance. 10 years ago, at the playground. That was you, wasn't it?" Richard's eyes softened. "You remembered?" "A homeless man pushed me away from a falling branch. You disappeared before I could thank you." "I've watched over both of you," Richard admitted. "It was all I could do to make up for leaving." "You never left," Thomas realized. "The anonymous donations, the stock dividends, you've been protecting this place all along. This center represents everything I believed in, everything I failed to teach you." Richard touched the wall. "When Victor brought those fraudulent papers 30 years ago, I knew the bank would take everything. But I couldn't participate in a crime." "So you disappeared to protect us," Thomas said. "I was a coward," Richard shook his head. "Instead of fighting, I ran. Left your mother to raise you alone." "But you stayed close." Sarah stepped forward. "All these years, helping people here. Trying to honor the promise." Richard pointed to the medallion in Thomas's hand. "Faith means doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." Suddenly, Eleanor's voice echoed through the chapel. "Richard?" Everyone turned. Eleanor stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her heart. "Eleanor." Richard's voice broke. "I'm so sorry." She walked slowly toward him, tears streaming. Then, to everyone's surprise, she slapped him hard across the face. 30 years, she cried. "Do you know what it did to us? To Thomas?" "Mom," Sarah gasped, but Eleanor wasn't finished. She grabbed Richard's shirt and pulled him into a fierce embrace. "Don't you dare leave again, you stubborn fool." Their moment was interrupted by commotion outside. Victor's voice carried through the halls. "Police! The eviction notice is legal. Clear the building." "He's making his move," Thomas said, "using my absence from the board meeting to force everything through." There's something else you need to know. Richard pulled papers from his box. Proof of what Victor did 30 years ago. I kept copies of everything. Before he could explain more, police officers entered the chapel. Behind them, Victor smiled triumphantly. How touching, a family reunion. His smile turned cruel. But this building is now Mitchell Enterprises property. Everyone out, now. You can't do this on Christmas Eve, Sister Mary protested. Watch me. Victor turned to Thomas. You missed the board meeting. They voted you out. I'm in charge now. Thomas looked at his father, the medallion, the proof in Richard's hands. 30 years of secrets and sacrifices hung in the balance. No. Thomas stepped forward. You're not in charge of anything anymore. Officers, Victor pointed at Richard. That man is trespassing. Remove him. As the police moved forward, Thomas stood between them and his father. Faith, Richard whispered. Family. Forever. Thomas nodded, finally understanding. It's time we kept that promise. Before you make any arrests, Thomas announced, there's something everyone needs to see. He took the documents from Richard's hands and started reading. These are the original papers Victor brought 30 years ago. Bank documents with forged signatures, fake property transfers. Thomas turned to the officers. My father didn't run from failure. He ran from fraud. Victor's face darkened. That's ancient history. Officers, do your job. Wait, Sarah called out, holding up her phone. I just forwarded 30 years of anonymous donations to St. Francis, all matching Mitchell Enterprises stock dividends. Grandpa never gave up his shares. He used them to protect this place. And there's more, Richard spoke up. 2008, during the financial crisis, Mitchell Enterprises was about to collapse. Thomas's head snapped up. What? A mystery investor bought enough shares to stabilize the company. Remember Thomas? That was you? Thomas whispered. Richard nodded. I sold my remaining shares to help. Couldn't let Victor destroy what you'd built. Lies! Victor shouted. Officers, remove these people. Hold on. One officer stepped forward, looking at his phone. We're getting calls from headquarters. The eviction notice. There are irregularities. We need to halt the evacuation. Sister Mary touched Thomas's arm. The people here, they have nowhere else to go. Thomas looked around the chapel. Families huddled together, elderly residents clutching their few possessions, volunteers who'd given up their Christmas Eve to help others. His father had spent 30 years protecting them all. You have a choice, Thomas, Victor sneered. Save this worthless shelter, or save your company. The board's decision stands. You're out either way. No, Eleanor stepped forward. The board needs a majority vote. 15% of shares must be present. Which they were, Victor smiled. Actually, Sarah interrupted, still on her phone. Checking company records. Dad's shares plus Grandma's trust. You were short. The vote's invalid. Victor's smile faltered. You're bluffing. Thomas squared his shoulders. Emergency board meeting. Now we'll conference everyone in right here. On Christmas Eve, they'll never. Watch me. Thomas started dialing. Time to show everyone who you really are, Victor. For the next hour, the chapel turned into a corporate battleground. Board members joined by phone as Thomas presented the evidence. Victor's original fraud, the false eviction papers, years of manipulation. You forced my father out to take control, Thomas addressed the board. Now you're trying the same trick. But this time, we have proof. The vote is clear, the board chairman announced. Victor Sterling is removed from Mitchell Enterprises, effective immediately. Thomas Mitchell remains CEO. This isn't over, Victor snarled, heading for the door. I'll bury you in lawsuits. No, called a new voice. Everyone turned to see District Attorney Helen Parker in the doorway. Actually, Mr. Sterling, you're under arrest. Securities fraud, conspiracy, falsifying federal documents. Merry Christmas. As officers led Victor away, Thomas turned to his father. I spent 30 years trying not to be you. Now I realize I never understood who you really were. You understand the medallion now, Richard said softly. Faith to do what's right, family above all, forever. Forever means the choices we make echo through generations, Thomas finished. He turned to Sister Mary. The St. Francis Center isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's going to grow. Eleanor took Richard's hand. Come home, she whispered. I'm not the same man who left. Richard hesitated. Good. Eleanor smiled through tears. Because we're not the same people you left. Maybe it's time we all changed. Sarah hugged her grandfather. Will you tell us stories? About all the people you helped here? Tomorrow, Thomas said. Tonight we have work to do. He turned to Sister Mary. This place needs Christmas dinner. And I think it's time the Mitchell family learned how to serve others. Richard picked up an apron with shaking hands. Faith, he said. Family, Eleanor added. Forever, Thomas and Sarah finished together. Outside, the storm had passed. Through the chapel windows, they could see stars beginning to shine on Christmas Eve. Christmas morning brought new challenges to St. Francis Center. News vans lined the street, reporters eager to cover the story of the homeless man who saved Mitchell Enterprises. I should go, Richard said, watching the crowd from the window. This attention isn't good for anyone. No more running. Thomas gripped his father's shoulder. We face this together. Sarah burst into the room. Dad, look at social media. People are sharing their St. Francis stories. Former residents who got back on their feet, families who found help here. The press wants statements, Eleanor added, and major donors are calling. They want to support the center. Before they could discuss further, Sister Mary rushed in. Thomas, we have a problem. Victor's associates at the bank. They're calling in loans on all Mitchell properties. They're demanding immediate payment. He's trying to destroy everything, Thomas realized. Even from jail. Use my trust fund, Sarah offered. Grandma said it's worth millions. No, Richard interrupted. I won't let another generation lose everything. He pulled out more papers from his box. There's something I never told anyone. The original St. Francis property deed. It lists mineral rights. Thomas scanned the document. Natural gas deposits under the center? Worth far more than Victor's development plans, Richard nodded. I discovered it years ago, but kept it secret. Selling those rights would save everything. But the drilling would destroy the neighborhood, Sister Mary protested, displace hundreds of people. Thomas faced a decision that would define the new Mitchell legacy. Save the company, or save the community, his father had protected for 30 years. What does the medallion say? Sarah asked quietly. Faith, family, forever. Thomas touched it in his pocket. Dad, you chose faith over money 30 years ago. Show me how to do the same. Richard smiled. You already know how. Thomas pulled out his phone and dialed the board. Emergency announcement. Mitchell Enterprises is restructuring. We're converting to a public benefit corporation. 50% of profits will go to community development. The shareholders will revolt, his assistant warned. Then let them sell. We'll buy the shares back, start a new kind of company. Eleanor watched her son with pride. Like father, like son. But their celebration was premature. Thomas's phone buzzed with urgent messages. Victor's banking allies were moving faster than expected. Asset freezes, credit line cancellations. The company had hours, not days. There's another way, Richard said heavily. My stock certificates, the ones I kept all these years. They're bearer bonds, untraceable, worth millions at today's value. The money you were saving to come home, Eleanor realized. Richard nodded. Enough to stop Victor's attack. But you'll have nothing left, Sarah finished. I'll have everything that matters. Richard hugged his granddaughter. Family. Thomas stared at his father. The man he'd spent decades resenting had been sacrificing everything to protect them all along. Make the transfers, Thomas decided. But not just to save the company. We're buying every property Victor's bank is threatening, starting with St. Francis. Sister Mary gasped. The whole neighborhood? Faith means doing what's right, Thomas quoted the medallion, even when it costs everything. As Richard signed over his last financial assets, reporters outside continued their coverage. The story was changing. Not just about a homeless man and his son, but about a community choosing people over profits. They're calling it the Christmas miracle on Milton Street, Sarah read from her phone. No, Richard corrected gently. The real miracle is standing right here, family coming together, choosing love over fear. Eleanor took his hand. But what will you do now? Where will you live? Thomas looked at the medallion one last time before handing it back to his father. That's an easy one, Mom. He's coming home. All of us are, Sarah added. We just had to remember what home really means. Outside, more residents arrived, bringing food for Christmas dinner. The neighborhood Victor had tried to destroy was coming together, stronger than ever. Merry Christmas, Dad, Thomas said softly. Richard gripped the medallion, 30 years of exile finally ending. Merry Christmas, son. The morning headlines spread across the city. Mitchell family Christmas miracle, homeless father saves son's empire. But in Thomas's office, the real story was unfolding in numbers and legal documents. The media attention is helping, Sarah reported, checking news updates. Stock price is up 30%. People love the public benefit corporation angle. Not everyone, Thomas's assistant interrupted, bringing more files. 3 major investors pulled out this morning. They're calling it corporate suicide. Thomas watched workers installing the new sign outside his window. Mitchell & Mitchell Enterprises, building community through business. The words his father had lived by for 30 years were now company policy. Look at this, Eleanor called from her laptop. Local news websites were flooded with stories. Former residents of St. Francis sharing how John had helped them rebuild their lives. A teacher revealing how anonymous donations had funded college scholarships. A family telling how they'd kept their home during the 2008 crisis thanks to a mysterious benefactor. Your father wasn't just helping people, Eleanor smiled. He was building a community. The moment was interrupted by Thomas's phone. The district attorney needed to speak with everyone immediately. At the courthouse, DA's Helen Parker laid out the situation. Victor's been talking, trading information for a lighter sentence. He claims he has evidence of tax fraud from the 1980s, says it could still hurt Mitchell Enterprises. More lies, Thomas started, but Richard raised his hand. No, he's telling the truth. Richard pulled out more papers from his ever-present box. I did sign those documents, but not the way he thinks. The room fell silent as Richard explained. I signed as a witness, proof that Victor and the bank were committing fraud. I kept copies of everything. That's why you disappeared, Eleanor realized. You weren't running from failure. You were protecting evidence. Evidence that's now 30 years old, the DA noted. This could get complicated. Sarah, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. Check social media. People from St. Francis are sharing more stories about bank officials threatening them in the 80s. About Victor's involvement. Thomas's phone buzzed. Media requests were pouring in. The story was growing beyond their control. We need to get ahead of this, the DA advised. Full disclosure. Every document, every story. It could crash the company's stock, Thomas's assistant warned. Then let it crash, Thomas decided. Dad spent 30 years choosing truth over money. We can do the same. Richard touched the medallion. Faith. Family, Eleanor added. Forever, Sarah finished. They released everything. Richard's evidence, the bank's fraud, Victor's schemes. 30 years of secrets exposed to daylight. The immediate impact was brutal. Stock prices plunged. Business channels called it the Mitchell meltdown. But then something unexpected happened. Small investors started buying shares, community members, former St. Francis residents, people touched by Richard's 3 decades of quiet service. Look at these messages, Sarah scrolled through her phone. My grandfather lost everything to that bank. The Mitchells exposed the truth. Buying shares to support honest business. Finally, a company that puts people first. Eleanor suddenly clutched her chest, stumbling. Mom! Thomas caught her. Just need to sit down, she gasped. The doctor's diagnosis was clear, stress-induced cardiac episode. Eleanor needed rest, minimal excitement. All these years, she whispered in her hospital bed, I kept our family's dignity through charity galas and social events. Now everyone knows. Knows what? Sarah held her grandmother's hand. That we're honest? That we choose right over easy? Richard hadn't left Eleanor's side. I'm so sorry. I thought disappearing would protect you. Instead, I left you to carry this alone. Thomas watched his parents, seeing 3 decades of pain finally surfacing. The price of truth was higher than just money. His phone buzzed again. The board wanted emergency meetings. Investors needed reassurance. The media wanted statements. But looking at his mother in the hospital bed, Thomas made another choice. Everything else can wait, he said. Family comes first, for real this time. Outside the window, more news vans were arriving. The Mitchell story was becoming a national sensation. But inside that quiet hospital room, a different story was finally reaching its resolution. A story about faith, family, and the true meaning of forever. 1 week after Eleanor's hospitalization, the Mitchell family gathered in the hospital waiting room. The doctor's update was encouraging. Eleanor was recovering well, ready to go home. The community support has been amazing, Sarah said, showing her phone to Richard. Look at all these get well cards from St. Francis residents. Speaking of support, Thomas added, checking his emails, the DA's office just confirmed Victor's conviction is final. His banking associates are facing charges too. Richard stood by the window, watching more news vans outside. All this attention, it's not what I wanted. But it's exactly what the community needed, came Eleanor's voice. She sat in a wheelchair, ready for discharge, looking stronger. Your story is giving people hope. Back at Mitchell Enterprises, the transformation was dramatic. The boardroom, once filled with profit projections, now displayed community impact reports. The lobby featured photos of St. Francis success stories. Latest numbers, Thomas's assistant reported. Small investor ownership up 60%. Corporate investors dropping out, but community investment groups stepping in. And look at this, Sarah pulled up a social media post. A major ethical investment fund was endorsing Mitchell & Mitchell's new direction. They're calling us a model for responsible business. Richard watched it all with quiet amazement. When I hid in St. Francis 30 years ago, I thought I was choosing between business and doing good. I never imagined they could be the same thing. The family's next stop was the courthouse. DA Parker had more news about Victor's case. His former banking colleagues are turning on each other, she explained. Decades of predatory practices coming to light. Your evidence started a domino effect, Mr. Mitchell. The truth always finds its way, Richard said softly. Thomas's phone buzzed, another crisis averted. The last of Victor's banking allies had withdrawn their attacks on Mitchell properties. The community's future was secure. Dad? Thomas turned to Richard. We need you at the company. Your experience with St. Francis, you understand community development better than anyone. Me? In business again? Richard hesitated. I'm not sure. You've been in business all along, Sarah pointed out. Just a different kind. Building people up instead of tearing them down. Eleanor took her husband's hand. It's time, Richard. No more hiding. At St. Francis, Sister Mary greeted them with news of her own. Other businesses were following Mitchell's example. New donations, volunteer programs, community partnerships. Your story changed things, she told Richard. People realize success isn't just about money. Thomas gathered everyone in the chapel where it had all started. We're turning St. Francis into the headquarters of the Mitchell Foundation for Community Development. Full funding. Permanent protection. And guess who's running it? Sarah grinned at her grandfather. Richard looked around the chapel, tears in his eyes. 30 years ago, I thought I lost everything, but I found something more valuable. Faith, Eleanor squeezed his hand. Family, Thomas added. Forever, Sarah finished. Outside, reporters waited for statements about Victor's conviction. Business channels wanted to analyze the company's transformation. Social media buzzed with the Mitchell story. But inside St. Francis, a family once torn apart by secrets stood united by truth. The medallion that had started it all hung proudly in the chapel, its promise finally fulfilled. Ready to face the cameras? Thomas asked his father. Richard straightened his shoulders. Together this time. Eleanor smiled from her wheelchair. All of us. The way it always should have been. As they prepared to meet the press, Sarah hung a new sign outside St. Francis, where faith meets family, forever. The Mitchell legacy was no longer about buildings or profits. It was about people, community, and the power of choosing right over easy. A different kind of success story. 30 years in the making. 3 months after the Christmas reunion, Mitchell & Mitchell Enterprises had become unrecognizable. The cold corporate offices now buzzed with community organizers and social workers. Where stock tickers once dominated, screens displayed program impacts and success stories. Latest report, Sarah announced during the morning meeting. Our first affordable housing project is ahead of schedule. 20 families from St. Francis will move in next month. Richard, now Director of Community Impact, nodded with pride. And the job training program? 15 graduates already employed, Thomas replied. 5 starting their own businesses with our microloans. Eleanor, fully recovered and serving on the foundation board, added her own update. The other corporations following our model? That number's up to 12 now. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several major investors had pulled out, calling it charitable madness. But for every corporate investor who left, 10 small community investors stepped in. People want business with conscience, Thomas told reporters. They're tired of choosing between profits and people. Richard's story had sparked something. Other companies faced pressure to reveal their own histories. Communities demanded accountability. The Mitchell model, as the press called it, was spreading. Look at this, Sarah showed her phone to Richard. A video of former St. Francis residents sharing success stories had gone viral. Your 30 years of quiet service started a movement, Grandpa. Richard still struggled with the attention. That morning, he'd tried to slip into his old spot serving breakfast at St. Francis. The residents treated him like a celebrity. I miss being just John sometimes, he admitted to Eleanor. You were never just John, she replied. You were always Richard Mitchell, even when serving soup. Now others can see what I always knew. Thomas called everyone to the conference room. The contractor had finished renovating St. Francis, expanding it into the Mitchell Foundation headquarters. Ready to see it? He asked his father. The changes took Richard's breath away. The soup kitchen had doubled in size. New classrooms for job training lined the halls. A medical clinic occupied one wing. But the chapel remained untouched. Richard's old box of newspaper clippings now displayed proudly in a case. This is what I dreamed of, Richard whispered. Back in 1980, before everything fell apart. Nothing fell apart, Eleanor corrected. It just took a different path. Sister Mary led them to the new computer lab, where former residents learned digital skills. Remember Kevin? She asked Richard. The teenager you helped get his GED? Of course. How is he? Starting college next fall. Business major. She smiled. Says he wants to be like Mr. Mitchell. Which one? Sarah asked. Both of them. Thomas watched his father interact with the residents. The shame that had driven him away 30 years ago had transformed into quiet dignity. Every person there knew his story now, and it gave them hope. The company's first quarter results are in, Thomas's assistant interrupted. Richard tensed, years of business instinct kicking in. How bad? Profits down 30%. Thomas smiled. But community impact up 400%. New investment applications increasing daily. This is what real success looks like. Eleanor touched the medallion now hanging prominently in the chapel. Faith. Family, Richard added. Forever. Thomas and Sarah finished together. That evening, as residents filled the dining hall, 4 generations of Mitchells served meals side by side. Richard in his familiar spot at the soup counter. Eleanor organizing volunteers. Thomas and Sarah learning from their example. You know what Mom would say about all this? Sarah asked her father quietly. Thomas looked at his daughter, remembering his late wife's compassion. She'd say it's about time. Outside, new signs were going up across the neighborhood. Mitchell Community Development Zone, building future together. The empire of glass and steel was becoming something warmer, something human. Ready for tomorrow's board meeting? Thomas asked his father. Richard nodded. 30 years serving soup was the best business training I could have had. Taught me what really matters. The medallion caught the evening light, its promise no longer a burden, but a guide. Faith had led them here. Family had made them whole. And forever was just beginning. 6 months after the Christmas reunion, the Milton Street neighborhood buzzed with construction activity. The first Mitchell Community Development Project was nearing completion, and families gathered to watch their future homes take shape. Hard to believe this was all going to be luxury condos, Sarah said, reviewing the project plans with her grandfather. 70 affordable units? Richard nodded, plus the job training center and daycare facility. Thomas joined them, carrying coffee for the construction crew. Remember when I used to avoid this neighborhood? Now I'm here every morning. The transformation went beyond buildings. Former St. Francis residents staffed the construction teams, learning trades while rebuilding their community. Local businesses that once faced closure now thrived with Mitchell Foundation support. The business press finally gets it, Eleanor announced, showing them her tablet. Mitchell Enterprises named Most Innovative Social Impact Corporation. They're calling it the future of ethical business. Richard still found the attention uncomfortable. I preferred being anonymous. Too late for that, Sarah grinned. Your story's part of the business school curriculum now. The Mitchell model, transforming corporate America. The family gathered for lunch at St. Francis, now a bustling community center. Sister Mary had news of her own. 3 more cities want to replicate our program, she reported. They're sending teams to learn our methods. Thomas checked his watch. Time for the ceremony. In the chapel, now restored to its original beauty, Richard and Eleanor prepared to renew their vows. 30 years of separation had only strengthened their love. Remember our first wedding? Eleanor straightened Richard's tie. In that little church in Boston? We had nothing then, Richard smiled. Just faith. We have everything now, she replied. Because of that faith. The chapel filled with family, residents, and community members. Sarah stood with her sister, both serving as bridesmaids. Thomas would walk Eleanor down the aisle. Before we begin, the minister announced, the community has something to share. One by one, people stood to tell their stories, how John had helped them through hard times, how the Mitchell Foundation had given them new starts, how a family's redemption had lifted an entire neighborhood. Eleanor wiped tears as she reached the altar. I thought I lost you, she whispered to Richard. You never lost me, he replied. I was just lost myself. After the ceremony, Thomas unveiled the surprise he'd been planning. The old Mitchell family home, where Richard had raised him, had been restored. Welcome home, Mom and Dad, he said, handing them the keys. Sarah had her own announcement. I've been accepted to graduate school. Social work and community development. Following in your grandfather's footsteps? Eleanor asked. Both of my grandfathers, Sarah hugged Richard. The businessman and the servant leader. The day's final event was at Mitchell Enterprises headquarters. Thomas stood before employees and press, his family beside him. Today we announce the Mitchell Foundation's largest project yet, $100 million to replicate our program nationwide. Community development centers, job training, affordable housing, the complete Mitchell model. Richard stepped forward, no longer hiding. 30 years ago, I thought business success and social responsibility couldn't mix. I was wrong. My son proved that. Now we'll help others prove it too. The applause was interrupted by breaking news. Victor, serving his sentence, had made a full confession. The extent of the banking fraud went deeper than anyone knew. He finally chose truth, Thomas said quietly. Better late than never, Richard replied. Everyone deserves a second chance. As evening fell, the family returned to St. Francis. Residents prepared for the night shift at their new jobs. Students studied in the education center. Children played in the safe, renovated playground. Look what faith built, Eleanor said, holding the medallion. What family preserved, Richard added. What forever promises, Thomas finished. Sarah watched a young mother receive her apartment keys, remembering how it all started one snowy Christmas Eve. Think we'll ever go back to the old way? She asked her father. Thomas shook his head. Some changes mark you forever. This is who we are now. Richard gazed at the community he'd served anonymously for so long. No more hiding, he said. No more shame. Just faith, Eleanor squeezed his hand. Family, the others joined in. And forever, they finished together. Christmas Eve arrived again at St. Francis Center, marking 1 year since the night that changed everything. The transformed facility buzzed with activity as hundreds gathered for the annual community dinner. But this year was different. This year, the Mitchell family wasn't just hosting, they were serving. More turkey? Richard asked, wearing his familiar apron at the serving line. The residents who'd known him as John still couldn't believe he was the same person whose story had made national news. Eleanor worked beside him, arranging desserts she'd baked herself. Save room for pie, she told each guest. Old Mitchell family recipe. At the door, Thomas greeted guests, CEOs and homeless residents alike. The business world had watched in amazement as Mitchell & Mitchell's new model proved successful. Profits were lower but sustainable, while community impact soared. Channel 7 wants another interview, Sarah told her father, helping an elderly resident to a seat. They're calling it the year that changed business. Thomas shook his head. Today isn't about business, it's about family. The newly expanded dining hall displayed photos telling the Mitchell story. Richard serving soup through the decades, the Christmas Eve confrontation, the family reunion, the company's transformation. But the centerpiece was the medallion mounted where everyone could see its message. Faith, family, forever. Remember last Christmas? Sarah asked, watching her grandfather laugh with residents he'd helped over the years. When you ordered security to throw him out? Different person back then, Thomas admitted. We all were. The Mitchell Foundation's first year had exceeded all expectations. The affordable housing complex, named Virtue's Village, had housed 50 families. The job training program had graduated 100. The microloan initiative had launched 30 small businesses, but the biggest change wasn't in numbers, it was in people. Richard no longer hid in shadows. His experience helping others had made him the perfect leader for the Foundation's programs. Business magazines called him the homeless CEO, but he preferred a simpler title, just trying to help. Eleanor had fully recovered, channeling her social connections into fundraising. The same society friends who'd attended her charity galas now volunteered regularly at St. Francis. Sarah had found her calling, deferring college to work full-time at the Foundation. Real education, she called it, learning from the community she served. And Thomas? The man who'd once cared only about profits now taught business ethics at the local college. His course, The Mitchell Model, Conscious Capitalism, had a waiting list. Special delivery. Sister Mary called out. A group of children from Virtue's Village entered, carrying handmade decorations for the Christmas tree. Each ornament told a story of hope. Look at this one. Richard picked up a paper angel. From Kevin's sister. She's starting nursing school next month. And this, Eleanor pointed to another. Maria's family. Their cafe opens in January. Thomas watched the children decorate the tree, remembering his own childhood Christmases. Dad, remember when you taught me to read using the medallion's words? Richard nodded. Faith means trusting in something bigger than yourself. Family means standing together in hard times, Eleanor added. Forever means our choices echo through generations, Sarah finished. The evening news played quietly on a TV in the corner. Victor's sentencing had made headlines again, but instead of gloating, the Mitchells had offered to help set up a prisoner rehabilitation program. Breaking the cycle, Richard explained. That's what second chances are for. As dinner wound down, Thomas stood to make an announcement. The room fell silent, residents and business leaders alike waiting to hear from the man whose transformation had inspired them all. 1 year ago tonight, I stood in this chapel and ordered security to remove a homeless man, he began. I thought I was protecting everything I'd built. Instead, I almost destroyed everything that mattered. He gestured to his father. That man turned out to be my father, who spent 30 years serving others while I served myself. He taught me that true success isn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed. Eleanor wiped tears as Thomas continued. Tonight, we're announcing the next phase of Mitchell & Mitchell's transformation. Every employee will spend 1 day a month serving at centers like St. Francis. Every project will include affordable housing. Every profit will help others profit. The room erupted in applause, but Thomas raised his hand. But that's not the real announcement. He smiled at his family. Dad, Mom, Sarah, we're moving the company headquarters here to St. Francis. The old offices will become a community center. Richard stood speechless as Thomas explained. Business should be where the people are, where we can see the faces of those we serve, where profit and purpose meet. Sarah hugged her father. Mom would be so proud. Outside, snow began to fall, just like last Christmas Eve. But this time, no one was being turned away. The chapel doors stayed open, welcoming all. A small girl from Virtue's Village tugged on Richard's sleeve. Mr. Mitchell, is it true you were really homeless? Richard knelt beside her. I had no house, but I was never homeless. Home is where your heart is. Mine was here all along, waiting for my family to find me. As the evening ended, 4 generations of Mitchells gathered around the tree. Great-grandchildren hung ornaments, while Eleanor and Richard renewed their wedding vows, their love stronger after 30 years apart. The true Christmas miracle, Sister Mary observed, isn't what happened to the Mitchell business. It's what happened to the Mitchell hearts. Thomas touched the medallion one last time before heading home. Faith had taught them to trust in something bigger. Family had brought them back together. And forever? Forever was just beginning. Outside, the St. Francis sign glowed in the snow. Where business meets compassion, the Mitchell way. Inside, Richard prepared for another day of service, no longer hiding, no longer ashamed. The former homeless man and the CEO who'd rejected him had both found their way home. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Thomas said softly. "Merry Christmas, son," Richard replied. "Faith. Family," Eleanor added. Forever, they all finished together as the snow fell softly on a community transformed by love. The true miracle of Christmas wasn't just one family's reunion. It was the reminder that in a world driven by profit, the greatest wealth comes from giving. That success isn't measured in buildings built, but in lives rebuilt. That even after 30 years of winter, spring can come again. Faith, family, forever. The words that had once driven them apart had brought them together, stronger than ever. And in the warmth of St. Francis Center, surrounded by the community they served, the Mitchells had finally found their true home. Not in a mansion on a hill, but in the hearts of those they helped. Not in the praise of business magazines, but in the smiles of children hanging ornaments. Not in the size of their bank accounts, but in the depth of their love. The true Christmas miracle was the discovery that it's never too late to change. Never too late to come home. Never too late to choose love over fear, service over self, family over fortune. And as the snow fell on St. Francis Center that Christmas Eve, the Mitchell family legacy was finally complete. Not in steel and glass, but in faith and love. Not in profits earned, but in lives transformed. Faith. Family. Forever. The true Christmas miracle had just begun. If this story touched your heart today, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you found a long-lost family member? Subscribe to our channel for more touching stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Remember, like faith, family, and forever, it's never too late for love to find its way home.